She was the girl who checked the keys. A shadow in a crisp uniform. Silent. Broken. Or so the world believed. The night the Emperor of Seoul's underworld, Baek Hyun-woo, stepped into the Grand Goryeo Hotel, the air itself seemed to thin. Men who lived by the blade and the bullet stood rigid, their hands trembling beneath their $1,000 suits. But when the silent hotel clerk approached the group, she didn't bow or avert her gaze. She looked the most feared man in Korea in the eye and spoke 7 words in a court dialect that hadn't been uttered since the fall of the Joseon kings. The lobby didn't just go quiet, turn to ice, because that wasn't a welcome. It was a claim to the throne, and only 2 people in that room understood that a war had just begun. This is the story of Uniseo, the clerk who was hiding a dynasty beneath her name tag. The night shift at the Grand Goryeo was less of a job and more of a high-stakes vigil. Situated in the heart of Gangnam, the hotel was a fortress of gold leaf, obsidian, and blood-soaked legacy. It was the kind of place where a single night's stay cost more than a year of Unseo's life, and the guests whispered about secrets that could topple governments. Kim Unseo smoothed her white button-up shirt until the fabric was perfectly flat. She adjusted her dark red bow tie, the color of dried blood, and tucked a stray strand of black hair back into her neat professional bun. She looked exactly like what she had spent 5 years pretending to be. A ghost. Kim. Check in for the VIP suite. Move. The night manager, a man whose greed was visible in every twitch of his eyelid, tapped a heavy ring against the marble counter. She didn't speak. She simply nodded, keeping her gaze fixed on the floor as she prepared the keycards. She moved through the lobby with a haunting, rhythmic grace. That was her armor. She had learned a long time ago that in a world of predators, the safest place to hide was in plain sight, as a girl who had nothing to say and nowhere to go. The heavy glass doors of the Grand Goryeo swung open, and the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't the winter wind. It was the arrival of Baek Hyun-woo. He moved with the quiet, terrifying grace of a predator who owned the forest, flanked by a phalanx of men whose presence turned the 5-star sanctuary into a war room. Elsa felt the familiar prickle of cold sweat at the nape of her neck. She kept her head bowed, her fingers gripping the edge of the marble check-in counter until her knuckles turned the color of bone. This was the moment she had spent 5 years dreading. The lead enforcer, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his eyebrow and a sneer that dismissed the entire staff as insects, slammed a heavy hand on the desk. Keys. Now, he barked. He turned to his companion, laughing as he used a coarse, ancient dialect, a guttural tongue used by low-level street thugs from the northern provinces, to mock the peasant girl behind the desk who wouldn't even look them in the eye. The air in the room grew thick, the silence of the other guests becoming a suffocating weight. Uniseo's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel the fire of the Kims rising in her chest, a heat she had tried to douse with 5 years of silence. She looked at her reflection in the polished obsidian of the counter, the red bow tie, the neat bun, the mask of a servant. Then she looked up. She didn't look at the enforcer. She looked directly at Baek Hyun-woo, who was standing 3 paces back, his eyes hidden behind dark aviators, his posture one of bored command. Mangukyui janchi nianun, she said. The voice that emerged from her throat wasn't the whisper of a clerk. It was the bell-clear, chillingly formal court dialect of the Joseon royalty, the language of the Kim bloodline. She had just told them, "You are not invited to the feast of a fallen kingdom." The enforcer's sneer vanished instantly. He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the holster beneath his jacket, but his feet refused to move forward. It was a biological reaction, an ancestral fear triggered by a tone of authority that shouldn't exist in a modern hotel lobby. Baek Hyun-woo froze. Slowly, he reached up and tilted his sunglasses down. For the first time in a decade, the man who controlled Seoul's shadows looked genuinely rattled. He stared at the girl in the red apron, his jaw tightening as the recognition hit him like a physical blow. He didn't see a waitress, he saw a ghost. "The Kim bloodline," Hyun-woo whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "You're supposed to be ashes." So didn't blink. She slid the VIP key card across the marble with a steady hand. Ashes, she replied in that same hauntingly regal tone, have a habit of burning those who try to sweep them away. The Grand Goryeo was a monument to the things Uniseo had lost: permanence, respect, and a name that carried the weight of history. For 5 years, she had existed within its gilded walls as a fragment of a person. She had arrived at the staff entrance in the winter of 2021 with nothing but a bruised spirit and the heavy bronze key to a life she was forced to abandon. To the world, Kim Eun-seo was a mute, a tragic, hard-working girl who had lost her voice to a childhood trauma. In reality, her silence was a fortress, the only thing keeping the predators from smelling the royal blood still coursing through her veins. Her life followed the rigid, lonely rhythm of the moonlight shift. While the rest of Seoul slept or danced under the neon lights of Gangnam, Eun-seo moved through the corridors of the hotel like a soft exhale. She was the one who buffed the smudges off the elevator mirrors at 4 a.m., the one who organized the leather-bound ledgers for the morning managers, and the one who stood behind the front desk when the guests were too drunk or too dangerous to be handled by anyone with a future. She lived in a tiny windowless studio apartment 3 blocks away, a space that smelled of laundry detergent and the green tea her grandfather, Kim Tae-shik, used to brew. There were no photos on her walls, no mementos of the Kim bloodline's former glory. To remember was to invite the pain back, and Uniseo couldn't afford to hurt. She had trained herself to think in the present tense. The floor is cold. Keys are heavy. The silence is safe. Every night, before she stepped into the lobby, she performed a ritual. She would tighten her dark red bow tie until it felt like a reminder of a collar, a symbol of her self-imposed servitude. She would look at her reflection and practice the blank stare, the look of a girl who saw everything but understood nothing. It was her greatest weapon. Men discussed assassinations and bribes while she stood 3 feet away, assuming her silence was a sign of a hollow mind. They didn't realize she was a living archive, recording every face, every name, and every transgression. But tonight the silence felt different. As she stood in the locker room, the air felt charged, as if the building itself knew that the 5-year countdown had reached 0. She touched the small, circular scar on the inside of her wrist, the mark of the Kim heirs. For 1800 nights, she had been a ghost. But as the elevator chimes signaled the arrival of the Beck syndicate, Uniseo felt the ghost beginning to breathe again, and she knew that by dawn, the girl who checked the keys would be dead, and the daughter of the Kims would finally be home. The stillness of the 3 a.m. shift didn't just break. It shattered. It began with the rhythmic thud of heavy black SUVs pulling onto the curb, their engines purring like idling beasts against the glass of the Grand Goryeo's entrance. She felt the shift in the air before the doors even moved. The lobby security, men who usually spent their nights scrolling through their phones, suddenly snapped to attention, their spines straightening with a terror that no amount of training could fake. Then the doors parted. Baek Hyun-woo did not enter so much as he occupied the space. He walked at the center of a phalanx of shadows, his presence a dark gravity that pulled every eye in the room toward him. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like it had been stitched together from the night itself, and even behind his aviators, the intensity of his gaze felt like a physical weight. Beside him was his lead enforcer, a man whose tailored blazer couldn't quite hide the bulk of the weapon at his hip, and a younger lieutenant who looked around the opulent lobby with the hungry eyes of a wolf in a sheep pen. Elsa stood behind the marble counter, her hands folded neatly in front of her bright red apron. She watched them approach through the periphery of her vision, keeping her chin tilted just low enough to maintain the illusion of a servant's humility. The syndicate members moved with a terrifying synchronization, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors like a countdown. As they reached the desk, the enforcer stepped forward, tossing a black titanium credit card onto the marble with a sharp clack. He didn't look at Eun-seo. He looked through her, as if she were merely a piece of the hotel's furniture. Behind him, Hyun-woo stood motionless, his head tilted slightly, sniffing the air as if he could smell the expensive jasmine of the lobby, or perhaps the faint metallic scent of fear. "The penthouse," the enforcer barked, his voice grating and arrogant. "And make it fast. The chairman doesn't like to wait." So didn't reach for the card immediately. She let a single beat of silence hang in the air, a tiny rebellious pause that only someone as observant as Hyunwoo would notice. She could feel his eyes shifting toward her, the lenses of his glasses reflecting the warm glow of the chandeliers. To the enforcer, she was just a nameless girl in a uniform. But to the man standing in the center of the storm, she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. The trap was set, the lion was in the den, and all that remained was for the ghost to speak. The enforcer's patience snapped like a dry twig. He leaned over the counter, his shadow swallowing in a slight frame, the scent of expensive tobacco and gunpowder clinging to his skin. "Are you deaf, girl? Or just as empty-headed as you look?" He turned back to the younger lieutenant, a cruel smirk tugging at his lips. "Look at this. The Grand Goryeo has gone to the dogs. They're hiring village peasants who can't even process a transaction without staring at their shoes." Then, he spat a phrase in a dialect so archaic and guttural it sounded like grinding stones, a low-born insult used by the street thugs of the northern borders to describe a woman of no value, a discarded thing. It was a linguistic slap, intended to humiliate her in front of the most powerful man in Seoul. The air in the lobby didn't just still, it died. The other staff members averted their eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But Usa felt a cold, ancient fire ignite behind her ribs. The empty-headed clerk they saw was a fiction, but the blood that sang in her ears was royal. 5 years of silence reached its breaking point. She didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She slowly straightened her spine, her posture shifting from a submissive curve to a blade-straight line of absolute authority. She looked past the enforcer, her eyes locking onto Baek Hyunwoo's hidden gaze. "The wind from the north carries the smell of the gutter," she said. Her voice wasn't the timid whisper they expected. It was a resonant, crystalline chime that carried to every corner of the marble lobby. She spoke in the Gungjung-eo, the high court dialect of the Joseon Palace, a language of silk and steel that had been the exclusive tongue of the Kim bloodline for centuries. "But a stray dog should know better than to bark in the presence of a dragon," she continued, her tone dropping into a chilling, regal command. "Drop your gaze, servant. You are standing on ground your ancestors were never worthy to tread." The enforcer froze, his hand hovering over his weapon, his face draining of color. It wasn't just the words. It was the impossible weight of her presence. It was the sound of a queen speaking to a peasant. Behind him, the younger bodyguards instinctively stepped back, their training bypassed by a primal ancestral urge to show deference to the voice of the Kim bloodline. Baek Hyunwoo slowly reached up, removing his aviators. His eyes, usually as unreadable as black glass, were wide with a shock that bordered on reverence. He didn't see a hotel clerk anymore. He saw the nightmare of his rivals and the legend of his childhood. "The hidden royal," Hyunwoo breathed, his voice a mix of wonder and terror. "You're alive." Sa slid the room key toward him, her subtle smirk finally touching her lips. "I am the only thing in this city more dangerous than you, Baek Hyunwoo. And tonight you're staying in my house." The moment the elevator doors hissed shut on the stunned faces of the Baek syndicate, the royal mask shattered. Sa didn't wait for the gears to grind into motion. She lunged for the emergency service panel, hidden behind a faux mahogany wainscoting. 5 years of mapping these veins of concrete and steel were about to be the difference between a legacy and a shallow grave. She wasn't just running from a man. She was running from the fallout of her own pride. The village greeting was a flare fired into a dark sky, and every predator in Seoul would now be converging on the Grand Goryeo to extinguish it. Sa ripped off her bright red apron, the silk that had been her camouflage, and threw it into a trash incinerator chute. Beneath, she wore a black tactical bodysuit she had hidden for half a decade, a second skin for a ghost finally ready to haunt. She dove into the service tunnels, a labyrinth of steam pipes and humming electrical grids that smelled of copper and damp earth. Above her, she could hear the muffled thud of heavy boots on marble. The syndicate's enforcers were no longer guests. They were hunters. "Level B2. Seal the exits." A voice boomed through the ventilation shafts, distorted but unmistakable. So moved with a frantic, silent grace, her boots barely touching the metal gratings. She knew the secret rhythm of the building, the 3-second delay in the security camera rotations, the service lift that bypassed the lobby, and the drainage pipe that emptied into the Han River's hidden tributaries. Her breath came in sharp, jagged hitches, her heart a drum echoing against the narrow concrete walls. She reached the junction of the main boiler room, where the heat was a physical blow to the lungs. In the flickering amber light of the pilot flames, she looked like a shadow birthed from the fire. She wasn't just a clerk anymore. She was a weapon that had been kept in cold storage, and as she pried open the heavy iron grate leading to the city's subarteries, she felt the transition finalize. The hotel had been her cage and her cocoon. Now, as the sirens began to wail in the distance, and the first of Hyunwoo's men rounded the corner with weapons drawn, Unsa vanished into the dark. The ghost was gone, and the hunt for the Kim bloodline had officially begun. The cold, damp air of the city's subarteries was a mercy compared to the suffocating opulence of the hotel. So navigated the dark with a map burned into her DNA, emerging blocks away behind a crumbling tea house that time and the glittering skyscrapers of Gangnam had forgotten. This was the sanctuary of Kim Tae-shik, her grandfather, a man who had been a whisperer to kings before his world was reduced to ash and silence. Inside, the scent of dried mugwort and ancient dust greeted her, the smell of a legacy in hibernation. She didn't head for the altar or the floorboards. Instead, she approached a weathered stone pagoda in the small, overgrown courtyard. With trembling fingers, she traced the carvings until she found a loose piece of granite shaped like a lotus. She pressed it, and with a heavy, grinding sound, a hidden compartment revealed a small box wrapped in tattered royal silk. Inside lay the jade seal of shadows. It was cold, pulsing with a deep, emerald light that seemed to swallow the dim moonlight. To an outsider, it was an artifact. To the Kim bloodline, it was a ledger. Its base was engraved with the names of every family, every politician, and every syndicate head who owed their rise to her grandfather, and the blood debts they had yet to pay. As her fingers brushed the smooth stone, the weight of 1,000 secrets settled onto her shoulders. This wasn't just a retrieval. It was an inheritance of war. Her grandfather had always said that the greatest debt wasn't gold, but a life owed. Looking at the seal, Unsa realized she held the leash to half of Seoul's underworld. A floorboard creaked behind her. Unsa didn't turn. She tucked the seal into her tactical belt, her hand instinctively going to the small, concealed blade at her thigh. "You were always the fastest student," a raspy voice whispered from the shadows. It was Enzo, or the man who had taken that name to protect her. He emerged from the dark, his face a map of scars and regret. "You fired the flare, Unsa. The 7 Stars Council has already authorized a cleanup of this district. You have exactly 10 minutes before the sky falls on this tea house." Unsa finally looked at him, the jade light reflecting in her hardened eyes. "Let it fall," she said, her voice resonant with the authority she had once tried to bury. "The Kims have lived in the dirt for long enough. It's time to see who survives the collapse." The rain began as a fine mist and turned into a downpour by the time Unsa reached the neon-drenched heart of Myeongdong. The district was a sensory overload of flickering LED billboards, K-pop hits blasting from shop entrances, and the frantic umbrella-to-umbrella dance of late-night shoppers. It was the perfect place for a ghost to lose herself, and the perfect place for an execution. She moved through the crowd, the jade seal of shadows heavy and cold against her hip. She could feel the eyes before she saw the barrels. It was a subtle shift in the street's rhythm. The street performers suddenly packed up, and the casual loiterers at the corner of the alleyway stood too still, their earpieces glinting under the artificial violet light. A laser dot, thin as a spider's silk, danced across the wet pavement near her boot. She didn't panic. She ducked behind a stack of shipping crates just as the first suppressed rounds hissed through the air, shattering a nearby storefront window into 1,000 diamond shards. These weren't the Beck Syndicate's brawlers. These were ghosts like her, a tactical hit squad from the 7 Stars Council, moving with the silent, lethal precision of professional cleaners. Targets sighted at North Sector, A voice crackled from a nearby radio. Elsa lunged from cover, sliding across the slick asphalt of a narrow side street. She used the chaotic reflections of the neon signs to mask her movement. Two gunmen rounded the corner, their faces hidden by ballistic masks. Elsa didn't reach for a gun. She reached for the heritage of the Kims. She swept the legs of the first man, using his momentum to slam him into the brick wall, then drove her palm into the second man's throat with a force that sent him gasping to the ground. But for every shadow she struck down, 3 more seemed to emerge from the rain. She was being herded toward a dead end, a blind alley where the neon couldn't reach. The metallic scent of blood began to mix with the smell of ozone and wet pavement. A black sedan screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley, blocking her only exit. The door swung open, and for a heartbeat was prepared to die. But the figure stepping out wasn't a 7 stars assassin. It was Baek Hyun-woo, his face illuminated by the rhythmic strobe of a red no-entry sign. He held a heavy handgun in one hand and reached out the other toward her. "Get in," he commanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the thunder. "Unless you want to see if the Kim bloodline is bulletproof." Elsa looked at the mercenaries closing in and then at the man who was her family's sworn enemy. With a curse in the forbidden tongue of her ancestors, she leapt toward the car. The sedan roared away from the neon lights of Myeongdong, the interior smelling of expensive leather and the metallic tang of fresh adrenaline. Elsa sat rigid, the jade seal clutched in her lap like a weapon. Beside her, Baek Hyun-woo drove with a focused ferocity, his hands tight on the wheel as he steered them toward a secluded safe house on the outskirts of the city. "Why help me?" Elsa's voice was like a shard of ice in the quiet cabin. "The Kims and the Baeks have enough blood between them to drown this city." Hyun-woo didn't look at her, his jaw set in a hard line. "I don't help ghosts, I help survivors. And right now, we have a common enemy that wants us both erased." They arrived at a brutalist concrete villa, hidden deep within the pine forests of Namsan. As they stepped into the foyer, the younger lieutenant, the one who had looked so confused in the hotel lobby, stepped forward to take Hyun-woo's coat. But as he leaned in, Unsa noticed a flicker of movement, a silver glint hidden beneath the silk of his sleeve. It wasn't a gun. It was a shuriken, a traditional needle-thin blade coated in a sickly, translucent film. "Chairman, the council sends their regards," the lieutenant whispered. Before Hyun-woo could react, the blade sliced through the air. Iniso's training, dormant for 5 years, moved her before her mind could process the betrayal. She lunged, her hand catching the lieutenant's wrist mid-swing. The force of her movement sent the blade skittering across the marble floor, but not before the tip grazed Hyun-woo's shoulder. "Traitor!" Hyun-woo roared, but his voice broke as the neurotoxin hit his bloodstream. He stumbled, his knees buckling. The lieutenant pulled a second blade, but Unasia was faster. She used the jade seal, the heavy stone of her ancestors, to strike him across the temple. The sound was a dull thud of finality, and the man collapsed into a heap. She caught Hyun-woo before he hit the ground, his weight pulling them both to the floor. His breathing was becoming shallow, his skin turning a ghostly gray. "The blade, it's widow's sigh," he wheezed, his fingers clawing at his chest. "No antidote." In the city, Elsa looked at the man who represented everything her family hated, and then she looked at the jade seal. She knew a secret her grandfather had kept from the ledgers. The seal wasn't just stone. Deep within the jade was a concentrated essence of cheonma, a legendary medicinal root. She didn't hesitate. She used the sharp edge of her concealed dagger to shave a sliver of the jade into his open wound. "You don't get to die yet, Baek Hyun-woo," she hissed in the court dialect. "You still owe the Kims a debt that can't be paid in a grave." The color returned to Hyun-woo's face with a violent, jarring suddenness. The essence of the cheonma within the jade acted like a physical shock to his system, burning through the neurotoxin with a heat that made his veins stand out like blue wire against his skin. He gasped, his lungs expanding as if he were taking his first breath of air after a lifetime underwater. He sat up slowly, leaning his back against the cold marble of the villa's foyer. Beside him lay the unconscious traitor, a silent reminder of how thin the line between power and a grave truly was. So stood over him, the jade seal now back in her grip. The emerald glow had dimmed, but the weight of it in the room was heavier than any weapon. "You used the Kim relic to save me," Hyunwoo said, his voice a rasping shadow of its former authority. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching hers for a hint of the submissive clerk he had seen only hours ago. He found none. "Why? You could have let the widow's sigh finish what your ancestors started." Didn't offer him a hand to help him up. She stood with the rigid, terrifying poise of a judge. "Dead men cannot fulfill their debts, Baek Hyunwoo. And your syndicate owes the Kims for every drop of blood spilled in the purge of 98. Hyunwoo let out a dry, mirthless laugh, clutching his wounded shoulder. "So this isn't a rescue. It's an investment." "It's a contract," she corrected, her voice dropping into the low, melodic register of the court dialect. "The Seven Stars Council has moved against us both. They have the guns, the government, and the greed of every minor boss in this city. But I have the ledger of debt, and you have the soldiers who are still loyal enough to fear you." Hyunwoo stood up, his movements still sluggish but his eyes beginning to burn with a renewed, predatory focus. He looked at the girl who had spent 5 years pouring water and checking keys, the girl who was now dictating the terms of his survival. The power dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably. The shaken king was no longer in command. He was a partner to a ghost who had finally claimed her throne. "A kingmaker and a king," Hyunwoo mused, stepping closer until he was within striking distance. He didn't move for his gun. Instead, he inclined his head in a gesture of respect that made the air in the room vibrate. "A dangerous combination." "The most dangerous," Unsa replied, her subtle smirk returning. "'Cause tonight we stop running. Tonight, we remind Seoul why the Kim name was never meant to be forgotten." The sun had not yet risen over the jagged skyline of Seoul, but the city was already trembling. In the penthouse boardroom of the Seven Stars Council, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the static of impending violence. The 7 chairmen sat in silence, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of a dozen monitors, waiting for confirmation that the last of the Kims had finally been silenced. The heavy mahogany doors didn't open. They were kicked inward. The council members stood as one, their hands reaching for the concealed weapons beneath the table. But they froze mid-motion as a woman walked into the room with the measured, terrifying grace of a ghost reclaimed. Unsa was no longer wearing the white button-down of a clerk. She wore a traditional hanbok of deep obsidian silk, the fabric shimmering like oil on water, and around her neck hung the jade seal of shadows, its emerald light pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Beside her, his shoulder bandaged but his eyes burning with a dark, renewed fire, walked Baek Hyunwoo. He didn't take his usual seat. Instead, he stepped to the side, bowing his head in a silent public admission of a new order. So walked to the head of the long table, the seat that had remained vacant since her grandfather was forced into exile. She didn't ask for permission. She sat, placing the jade seal on the glass surface with a sound that echoed like a gavel. "The night is over," she said, her voice a crystalline chime of the high court dialect that made the elder's skin crawl. "For 5 years you watched me pour your water and check your keys. You laughed at the mute girl, while you built your empires on the bones of my family. But silence is not absence. It is a gathering of strength." She opened the silk-wrapped ledger. "I have read your debts. I know which of you sold your souls to the prosecutors and which of you paid for the hit on the Grand Goryeo. The Kim bloodline does not seek an apology. We seek a settlement." One of the elders, a man whose greed had outpaced his wisdom, reached for his gun. Before he could clear his holster, Hyunwoo's hand was on his throat, pinning him to his chair. "The queen is speaking," Hyunwoo growled, his gaze sweeping the room. "And you will listen." Tessa leaned forward, her subtle, knowing smirk finally settling into a mask of absolute command. She looked at the men who had once been the masters of her world and saw them for what they were. Servants waiting for a leader. The Grand Goryeo has a new owner, she declared, the emerald light of the seal reflecting in her eyes. And Seoul has a new shadow. My name is Kim Unseo, and the bloodline has returned.